Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artists Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere.
Hi, this is Ron Fortier with another episode of the Artist Index podcast, In Focus podcast. And I'm really super excited by this particular guest because I have been trying for a long time to get somebody who's associated with the jazz community in New Bedford. And the reason for that, you're going to find out about during this podcast. If you don't already know, the city of New Bedford was at one time considered one of the top jazz stopovers in the United States on the East Coast. It was a big jazz town, okay? Back when jazz was big itself. It's, there's so many other genres of music now that there are aficionados and there are people who love jazz. But enough of all that jazz right now. I'm gonna have the guests introduce themselves and spell their names. Guest?
Hey, I'm David Reese. Actually, it's David Reis. My family's from Cape Island in Portugal, and Americans, we say Reese, but they would correct me. It's Reis.
That's right.
That's and Ron knew that right away. When Ron saw my name, he pronounced it better than I did. Yeah. I'm considered a jazz historian. I did jazz radio here at UMass Dartmouth for 26 years. And jazz is my passion, especially the history of jazz. I grew up in it, musicians in my house. My uncle Joe Livamento was a sax player, went on to play in New York, and his best friend, who I call my uncle, lived with us because he was from Pawtucket, Paul Gonsalves, who Duke Ellington called Paul Gonsalves. Here we go with the names again. And Paul Gonsalves was from Pawtucket, so he stayed at my grandmother's house when he played here in New Bedford.
Yeah, I've heard so much about the jazz scene, the jazz community in this city, and it's something I really wanted to do. My mother was, as I told you, she was a performer, a stage performer, a singer, primarily club singer, and she did American Standard stuff, and she also did fado, which was her main passion. So growing up in that kind of environment, it was multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-genre, multi-everything. I remember when Carmen Miranda came out, and it was such a big thing. My mother, started, checking the charts for her songs, and I think she actually did one of the standards, the jazz standard, "Come On to My House," Rosemary Clooney's big hit.
Yes.
And that was what was so great about jazz back then. It was such a mixture of people. We talk about diversity today like it's a brand new thing.
Exactly.
And then I was watching Respect last night on Prime Video, because my wife is from Detroit, and I never realized that Aretha, for example, never signed with Motown, and she lived a couple of blocks away.
Right.
But there was that one scene where she's finally going to break out with that 1967 hit, her breakout hit. And they take her to Muscle Shoals recording studio, and they expected to see a bunch of Black musicians when they walked in. And that's an amazing scene. And what's so cool about that scene is it shows not every musician, but it shows musicians far ahead of society as accepting each other because of their craft.
Yes.
So talk to me about that, because we can't talk about jazz. We can't talk about jazz in New Bedford without talking about the Cape Verdean community. And there's so much more that goes with it. There are gifts and there is baggage. Tell us everything. Blow your brains out.
Okay. All right. Well, it's jazz in New Bedford. What happened is jazz in New Bedford, big band. It was big band music at that time in the 40s. They started at Cape Verdean jazz leader. Duke Oliver started an orchestra. He didn't perform any instruments, but he did like Cap Calloway. He wore tails in front of the band and directed the band and danced in the band. It was the Duke Oliver band. But how that started originally, that was like the first generation here in New Bedford. Their parents all came from Cape Verde Islands. And the men, older men from Cape Verde Islands, started Ultramarine Band Club, which is later was known as the Band Club. There was a lot of jazz there, and it became a popular club. But at that time, they didn't have a nightclub there. It was a club they started where they had their meetings, and they started a marching band, the Ultramarine Cape Verdean Marching Band. And then on Saturday afternoons for a nickel, which was a lot at that time, we're talking about early 40s or even earlier, and for 5 cents, a kid could go on Saturdays. They would teach them music, and they would teach them music, but they wouldn't give them an instrument. They would teach them. They called solfege. They call that. And when they could write music down, and the kid could sing it and knew their music, then they'd give them an instrument, and then they'd learn. But they were doing this for their marching band. So as these guys got older, for their own time, they decided to start playing jazz because there was big bands at that time, Duke Ellington, Count Basie. And that's when the Duke Oliver Band started, and Phil Edmund Band. There was a couple of bands in 1942. And then from the big band era, later on, big bands, it wasn't affordable to hire them. And then he started with the little small jazz groups. And that's when New Bedford got famous with a jazz band, jam sessions, they called it. And they'd have different clubs like the Band Club, Cape Verdean Band Club would have it. And there was another club they called the Bomb Shelter because during the Second World War, you had the bomb shelters you would hide in case you got bombed. And this man had this club down in his cellar, so they called it the Bomb Shelter. And all these places would have jam sessions. And the club owner, what was really nice about jam sessions, opposed now, you see a band leader. But a jam session at the time, they'd hire a trio or quartet, and then all the musicians would come in their instruments and they'd sit in. So the club owner would hire 4 guys, but they'd have 10, 12 guys to play. And that's how they created their jazz, learning from each other. It wasn't like you went to Berkeley or anything like that. They were just learning from each other. One tenor player would help another guy, how he did this. And then the thing about jam sessions could be funny at sometimes because guys would come in their horns and they got invited to come up and play. And some were good. You were happy when they walked in. And then some weren't that good, but they didn't want to insult them. But they said, oh, here comes so-and-so with his horn. And he'd go up and play. Yeah. And then
you mentioned a couple of things. I would just want to jump in. The Paddock Club, was that one of the venues too?
what?
The Paddock Club. I think it's now the pasta place there. It used to be, oh my God, what was the previous name of it? It's in Fairhaven. I think that was the Paddock Club. And I thought that was a jazz venue at one point. Yeah.
Yeah, that I can't remember. I know in Fairhaven, they had, actually it was a Christian, there was a club called the Kettle, and actually it was a strip joint, but on Sunday afternoons, they used to have jazz there, jam sessions there.
Was the Hangers, which was a strip club as well? Is that the same place with a different name?
No,
It's a different place.
Right when you enter the Christian from New Bedford.
Okay.
It was right there at the intersection.
Okay. Bert's, was it Bert's Uptown or Bert's Downtown? Was that?
Yes. Bert's Grill became the most famous jazz club in New Bedford after the second owner. It was Bert's Grill. It was on the corner of Union and Pleasant. And they would have jazz there. In fact, Joe Livermento, my uncle, his group played there. I have pictures of him playing there. And then later on, it was bought out and became the Piccadilly.
That's right.
Piccadilly was the big buzz joint. They were bringing groups in from New York. There were a lot of musicians that came there, weren't famous, but they were from New York. And then later on, they were famous, like Jimmy Smith, the organist, used to play here with a trio called the Don Gardner Trio. And a lot of other jazz musicians. Cat Anderson, Duke Ellington's trumpet player, came here, and he would come in with a combo, and he'd have guys from the Duke's band. So a lot of famous people play there, and then they'd play music there from Monday. The band would come in from Monday to Sunday, So it's 7 nights a week. And then on Sunday afternoon, they would have a jam session from 2 to 6. On a Sunday, you didn't know where to go because there was a jam session there. There was a jam session at the band club. There was a club up to the West End, social United, no, not United Social, West End social, and they had jazz there on Sundays. You'd run around and catch a set from here to there. You couldn't sit all. So the Piccadilly actually, before the Piccadilly, most of the jazz were in like the West End social I just mentioned was a African American club of the West End, and then the Cape Verdean Band Club. That's where all the jazz were all the clubs of people of color, and then the musicians would come sit in. And then when the Piccadilly was downtown, they started having jazz there. So you already had clientele from all over the city coming in there. So then that's when you got mixed audiences too.
Wow. Yeah, there's just so much going on. And I think too, I'm just flashed on something. I think the International Club on Route 6 in Westport, I think that was another one. And again, these are just, I'm just pulling things from memories, the trash, the trash bin in my mind.
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Let me ask you about the Berklee School of Music, because I swear, just based on what I've heard, that the Cape Verdean community specifically between faculty at Berklee and students at Berklee, and students, faculty who were students, and I mean, it's amazing the amount of interplay between the Berklee School of Music and New Bedford primarily.
Yes, well, the Piccadilly, I said they had the Sunday afternoon jam sessions, and it was mostly musicians. They bring in musicians from Piccadilly. In fact, Tashiko, the famous piano player, when she was a student, she played at Pick on Sundays from 2 to 6. Like I say, a lot of musicians played here, then became famous. So the Sunday afternoon sessions were mostly musicians from Berklee. They bring them down. There's Phil Barboza, who was a band leader, one of the first band leaders here in New Bedford. He would bring these artists down because he had moved to Boston and he was working out of Boston on Sundays from 2 to 6 at the Piccadilly.
Wow. Go ahead.
No, another thing beside the Piccadilly, even before the Piccadilly, when it was the band club and the West End Social, a lot of artists would be playing in Boston say they'd be playing for the week in the evenings in Boston, and they'd go up and get them and have them come down and play in the band club on a Sunday afternoon from 2 to 6 and get them back to Boston for their night gig, in time to get that. So the connection with jazz, Boston and New Bedford was very close. Yeah.
Any recordings of these sessions?
Not that I know of.
You figure somebody bring an old Fisher reel-to-reel to the...
Yeah. See, I'm talking like back in the 50s, Yeah. And I don't know of any recordings. The musicians probably recorded themselves, and because I know, I don't know of anybody in jazz. There was a Cape Verdean musician. He also played jazz too. And he recorded every session he played in the Cape Verdean bands. He had recordings of all that. But jazz, I don't know. No, he's passed away. I don't know.
The recordings,
he's passed away.
Yeah. See, that's another goal of the Artist Index too, especially if we can get people to step forward. Whether it was their Bavu, whether it was their Tia, it doesn't matter. Who, and for those who don't understand Portuguese, their grandfather, either their grandmother, their aunt, their uncle, their cousins, brothers, sisters, anybody who was involved, that, left a mark. And it's about resurrection. It's about bringing them back and putting them in history, where they belong. And that's why, we have those bookmarks that we pass out that says bookmark your place in history. And you're doing that right now by having this podcast, and based on the transcript, they're they'll mine this transcript for some of these things that you said, and get more research. And we really need to have the history, because so much of it has been erased.
Yes. And that's my passion. In fact, South Coast Learning Network, they had a South Coast Money Network. I don't know if you heard about it.
Yeah, Sandria.
Yes, Sandria
And Bert.
Parsons.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I did a class for them. I called it "Let's Talk Jazz," and that's what it was about. And
Wow.
it was well attended. And then that went away. But yeah, that's been my passion anyway. And I grew up this year. I was a little kid, and like I say, and I lived with my grandparents and my uncle. We all lived. My grandfather bought a house. All my family lived in a tenement house. And being the little boy, and when everybody's going to work, my Uncle Joe and Paul, being musicians, they were home. So I tailed along with him all the time. It wasn't my choice. They were like my babysitters while I was in work. So I just grew up with the older musicians. I was the little kid with them all the time. Yeah. So that's always been my passion. Yeah.
Now, do you play anything?
I fool around with a bass in the house.
With all that exposure. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I always thought I wanted to be an athlete, and then I was young when they take me around, and then they played sax in the house every morning. I wake up to hear them playing sax, and then they said, "You want to play?" I said, "Yeah, I'll play." So they gave me a clarinet. I didn't like the looks of clarinet. I said no. They said, "No, you're small. You have to learn on a clarinet. Then you move to the sax." But my interest was always in sports anyway.
Yeah.
I was around it all the time, but around the music. That was my background, but I was out playing ball. Yeah.
Any regrets?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I really do great, because I could be playing that forever,
Yeah.
Can't play ball forever.
Now, how did you start at what was then SMU, and then the college, the campus radio station was WUSM because somebody else owned the license for SMU, but which confused the heck out of people. But USM, right?
Yeah, and then it was WMD. What happened is they sold. I think it was Boston University wanted to come in where WUSM came in, and they sold that, and then they went to the new name on another channel. They moved to channel. That's what happened. And then it's the last station we had. They sold that, and that's why we're not there anymore. Sold to NPR.
Yeah, they're part of the Rhode Island public.
Yes, NPR.
Yeah.
So that's what happened. Because I was involved, with jazz all the time, and Bobby Green, we had a great alto player, came to the city. He came in the band. Bobby Green, Herbie King, real good musicians, and they were touring, and the band broke up here in this area, and they ended up staying here, and ended up living here. And when he first started with the jazz program at UMass Dartmouth, he called me, and my kids were younger. They did Sundays, and I said, "No, I can't do it right now." So later I got on, as my kids were old. I just didn't want to give up my Sunday afternoons. My kids were really young.
Yeah.
So that's how I got on. Yeah.
So there's Bobby Green. Herb King was a percussionist, right?
Yes, he was. Okay. Great drummer. Bobby was a fine alto player.
Coleus was the name of their group.
Yes.
There was Armstead Christian.
Armstead Christian came after. Yep. Armstead wasn't in Coleus.
No. Yeah. That's just another Rick Brito. I remember him because he used to do record commercials for me when I had an advertising agency.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Under oh my God, I still have his business card, and I'm it was something like Stegosaurus or something Saurus on it. Could have been Britosaurus. Yeah, Rick. Yeah.
He lived right across the street from me here. I live up the West End, and Rick lived across the street, and I went outside to get something. Bump into him, we'd be talking for an hour. So,
I went over his house. Yeah.
Oh, was it when he lived on Ocean Street?
Yeah. That's where we used to.
I lived on the corner.
Yeah, we used to do the commercials there, and he was so far advanced with sound. At that time, he was doing DAT, digital audio tape, and I delivered a tape to a radio station, and they're looking at me like, "What's that?" And I said, "That's a DAT tape." No, not what's DAT. What's that? And I said, "It's a DAT tape." And they didn't know what it was because they were still using 8-track, believe it or not. They would cart,
Wow.
the carts were 8-track in radio up until, oh my God, almost 2000, probably a little later. It
Wow.
was absolutely amazing. So we'd have to take that DAT tape, transfer it to reel,
Oh,
give
man.
it to them, and then they would transfer it to, cart it on 8-track.
Yeah. Wow. And
That's
now,
like taking a race pony and making it into
I know
a hobby horse.
what a difference. Look right now, I'm talking to you on my iPhone.
Yeah,
What
yeah,
a difference. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how many years were you at USM?
26.
26. Now,
Yeah.
Jim Oliveira, did you guys co-host the show at one time, or did you guys do
We
separate
all
shows?
we alternated. What happened was, at first we had a lot of DJs when I first came on. We alternated, and so he'd do this Sunday, and then next Sunday I would do it, and then the third Sunday someone else, and then I moved up to the afternoon, and then we lost a lot of DJs after a while, so we did Sunday afternoon, and later on I did Friday afternoon there when I retired from my job, and then towards the end I was on Wednesday evenings. Yeah.
You had a lot of staying power, obviously, because I mean, just in the 4 years that I was there and the couple of years that I was associated with the university prior, because I actually started going on campus when I was a junior, senior in high school, because I worked for the opera department. Between the torch and the radio station, it was amazing how many, it was always in flux. Of course,
Right.
it's a 4-year turnover basically.
Right.
But both you and Jim, the staying power was absolutely amazing. What's one of your best memories from your jazz radio days?
Well, the best matter of fact, the reason why I stayed 26 years, I'm not that I didn't like it, but I wouldn't leave it. My best thing out of that, when I got on and I started playing, then being older, I was playing a lot of the older musicians like Coleman Hawkins, and elderly people would call me and they'd be so thankful to hear the artists that they knew. And then that wasn't the thing, but then I found out a lot of them were shut-in people, and they looked forward to radio so much, especially a jazz program where there were so few. And they would call me, even to the point that, and just in recent years, one woman died. She was an elderly woman shut in, and I would play Frank Sinatra and Joe Williams for her. Every show, I would make sure I played them because she liked it. And her daughter called me. The woman had passed away, and they asked me if I would do the readings at the mass, at her funeral mass, because she loved listening to my program so much. I meant so much for her. And then I've had other people, and I found out that radio was so important to them. They had nothing else. And that's why I would never leave. And that's why I felt bad when the radio station closed, because that's something that I learned by being on the radio. So that was my favorite thing, knowing that people looked forward. It meant something to them. And then I also had a lot of interviews that I enjoyed. I like having the interviews.
Isabel Livermento.
Yes.
I've been trying to get her to do a podcast, and she give me everybody else's name, but she wouldn't do it. Now she's your
she's my Uncle Joe Livermento. That's the reason why I'm involved with jazz.
Yeah.
It plays that she married him. She was married to him. Yeah, she's in her 90s now. She lives in Rhode Island, so I can see why, because she has a great knowledge of it. I don't know if you ever saw the Big Band in New Bedford. It's on YouTube. It was done by the local TV channel. They interviewed her and I, not even knowing that we were related.
Really?
Yeah.
And it was called The Big Band?
Big Band. You look up on YouTube, Big Band, New Bedford, I believe it was called.
Okay.
If not, I can text it over to you. But yeah, just look Big Band, New Bedford. The local cable channel did it.
Now, when I was a kid, my mother had put me into they didn't call it daycare back then. It was a nursery. It was the Children's
Right.
Corner Nursery behind the Capitol Theater.
Mhm.
And Juliet, the heck was their last name? Denault, who was her
Mhm.
name was Juliet Gonsalves, and the family owned the Mayflower Furniture Company. Tony Gonsalves was a drummer. Did you ever
Mhm.
run it? And he was a jazz drummer. Did you ever run across him?
Probably did if he was a jazz drummer, because like I say, all the musicians would show up when the other musicians played. That was a different thing too than in those days. When the musician played, the other guys went play and they'd be there, and they, like I say, they would sit in. So I probably did if he was playing in the Bedford
Right.
area, and I used
His
to go to all the
nephew,
events.
his nephew Toby was uh, a bass player, but it was electric bass, but it was, if I believe correctly, it was like a standing electric bass. It had the stick on the bottom
Yeah,
of it. I think
yeah,
they had a different name for that, didn't they?
yes, they did. Yeah, I can't really remember the name, but I know one was Ampeg Baby Bass.
Uh-huh.
Ampeg made one. They call it the Baby Bass,
Yeah.
and but that for some reason that fell out. The guys wanted to go back to that wooden bass. You know, they would play that because it's something new. But most of the guys that I knew went back to the original bass because of the sound.
The sound, yeah. The
Yeah,
sound was important.
right. Especially the bass. Yeah.
Walking bass. Can you it just popped in my head how the whole walking bass line was such a big thing. And it's funny because because of my mom's influence and father, and I'm listening to some of these, traditional way back, and I swear, and I'm not a musicologist by any, I swear I can hear walking bass in those Portuguese bass lines, what they call the viola,
Right.
which was basically a bass guitar
Right.
that acoustic that you would have on your knee,
Right. Right. Yeah,
But
I
what about
remember that.
walking bass? What makes that such a
Well, the walking
thing?
bass, that's what bass was in originally. They just walk, boom, boom, every other bar chord. The chords were skip. That's what the bass was. That's how bass started. Actually, before bass, they did that with the tuba, the old jazz bands in New Orleans. Then they switched to bass. And then later on, Jimmy Blanton was the first one started doing other things on the bass. But that's all they did, how they played the bass originally. They had that
No,
beat behind the band, and they just walked the bass to keep the beat going. And then Jimmy Blanton started doing other things on the bass and playing melody, and that's what happened. But walking bass was the original bass.
now today's music, there's two definite things that are missing, and I've heard people, much more intelligent in music than me, talking that there's a shortage of drummers because all these kids are using drum kits,
Right. Mm-hmm.
and bass again doesn't exist either. It's all on a keyboard, a bass, and that's taken the roundness out of
Exactly. It's true.
music.
Yeah. And like everything progresses and things change, and like the jazz I knew, and that's why I say like the other people that called me on the radio were so happy to hear the jazz that I knew, the original with no electronics and everything, piano, bass, drums,
Yeah.
and but like everything else, it's just like I say, we're on this iPhone. We didn't have an iPhone, and so newer generations don't know a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
Jazz.
Is there a resurgence? Are it seems like the kids are all crazy about the Rat Pack, and they don't call it the 50s, they call it mid-century. Is there a resurgence with
I
young
wish there
musicians?
I wish it was, but I don't think so. I volunteered with a high school jazz band, Russ Campoli, and I used to work with them, help them out with the kids, and I used to introduce them when they performed someplace and all that. And towards the end, he couldn't even get kids to join the jazz band. And they're having the same problem with sports too. There's so much things now happening for the young people to do that it's hard for them to commit to one thing, to commit to be in band rehearsals or team practices, because they have so many other things going on.
Yeah.
I don't believe there's a resurgence.
Now, when you and I met at Anthony Barboza's book signing for his book I Dreaming, which was absolutely fantastic, and I asked you about because I'm like a parrot. I'll only repeat what I hear, or I'll ask a question based on what I heard. So I don't have any great depth of knowledge. But Paul Gonsalves, from what I heard, as we discussed, and I've mentioned it several times, I think on the podcast, was associated with the Duke Ellington Band and
Yes.
orchestra.
Mhm.
And I don't know what the reason was for the orchestra not doing well. I don't know if they weren't getting bookings or they had an internal problem with the musicians. But at the 65, I think it was, Newport Jazz Festival, which became a world
No, it
famous.
was 57.
It was 57. Aha.
57. Mhm.
Okay. See, and it became a world-class venue, which is
Mhm.
amazing. And he did a 23 chorus.
27. 27 crores. 27
That's why I'm
crores.
asking.
I have an amazing memory.
Yeah. Oh, yes, you do. 27.
Everybody calls me for different questions in my family.
You got to go on Jeopardy for jazz,
Yeah.
But 20. First of all, 27 choruses, and it was on what instrument and what is a chorus?
Tenor saxophone. How to fix with choruses. There's so many choruses to a song, so many notes is a chorus.
Mhm.
So you play so many choruses and you stop. But what happened with Paul is, in fact, the Duke's band wasn't doing well. It had nothing to do. Duke, there was the fact basically big band weren't hired anymore. They couldn't afford it. The big bands that died out. In fact, Count Basie was the other big band. He had stopped his band for a while. Then they went back later on. They weren't getting hired. There was no venues for big bands anymore. And that's why you get the small quintets like Miles Davis and all those guys came out of big bands. And then they ended up, because they weren't getting any jobs anymore, and they weren't recording them as much. So what happened to Paul was, and it's ironically, Paul was the Mendo Crescendo in Blue was the tune. That's two tunes, and so there's a gap in between from one tune to the other where Paul would take a solo. When he finished solo, they went to the second tune, and when he took his solo, this woman started dancing. And she kept dancing, so Paul wouldn't stop playing. The more she danced, the more she played. And ironically, Paul was in New Bedford, and the woman that was dancing, he didn't know. She was the Zeiterian Theater, the Zeitz family, the Arnold Theater. She was a Zeitz, so she was from that family. So there was a New Bedford woman dancing and a New Bedford saxophone player playing, and that's the most famous solo in jazz. And 27 choruses, and then the concert was supposed to end, but Duke Ellington was smart enough not to end it because the crowd was so riled up. He said if he had stopped, they probably would have rioted, So he played a couple of more tunes, and George Weiner was trying to get him to stop. If you get the recording, you get to hear George Weiner tell him stop. But he was smart enough to know if he ended it just like that after Paul.
How long did that go on for?
27 choruses, at least 10 minutes, at least. Yeah.
And as far as one of the Zeitzes, I had the pleasure of interviewing Barney Zeitz when I was working for the city of New Bedford for the Office of Historic Preservation, because we were going to put that building, the Zeiterian, on the National Register. Had I only known, because I know the family was quite something else. I mean, they were all over the place.
They owned mostly everything. They owned mostly everything downtown. And her brother was a big jazz fan. Because the woman that was dancing. Brother, She was another thing. She was part of the people that ran the Newport Jazz. Originally, before the Jazz Festival, the wealthy people of Newport asked George Weiner to set up something for them there in Newport. George Weiner was a club owner of Storyville and producer in Boston. And he was a man of jazz. And he was a piano player also, but he got into promoting business. He promoted all the jazz festivals all over the country after Newport. And so then later on, they asked him, no, he did that and it was successful. Then he thought maybe we should, this was a private jazz festival in Newport, maybe we should do this. And that's how it started. He talked to them and did it. And she was one of the families that put on that party that he got the idea from. And she was dancing. They said that's why security wouldn't stop her from dancing, because who she was. And she wouldn't stop dancing, and Paul wouldn't stop playing.
And history was made. What a great story. Exactly. I'm so glad I got this chance to have you on this podcast and ask you that. Now, how other jazz musicians, other musicians from this area that went on to national acclaim, international acclaim, who would those people be?
There was quite a few. Of course, Paul was playing here. Phil Barboza. First, he had a band he called it Phil Edmond. Then he went to his real name, Phil Barboza. And Paul was here playing with him, and he's playing in Boston with another band, Sabby Lewis. You know, guys would get a gig just 2 days here with this guy. And Count Basie called for Paul Gonsalves. Somebody recommended he needed a sax player. And then Paul went on, he played with Count Basie for a while. And then he went on, he played with Dizzy Gillespie's orchestra for a short time. And then Duke called for him, and he went to Duke, and he never left Duke's band until he passed away. And he was in that one band. Then my Uncle Joe Livermento was his best buddy. They moved to Boston together. Then they moved to New York together. Joe played with the Jimmy Lunceford Orchestra, Lucky Millinder, Candido, Roy Eldridge, and Machito, the Afro-Cuban Orchestra, and also at the Polo Theater. Then we had a trombone player, Bobby Pring. He was a trombone player. He was in the Air Force, out of the Air Force Band. He went on with Tex Beneke, Les Brown. He did movie soundtracks. We had quite a few. And we had quite a few that just didn't decide to leave. They could have done it. Quite a few musicians, they didn't want to do that as a career. And we had Lionel Soares, who was a fine alto player, clarinet player, went over to the West Coast. And he did a lot of movie things, soundtracks. He was
my old music teacher.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, but I was his worst student.
Oh, is that right? Lionel was a nice man too, and he did well. My Uncle Joe, and he and Lionel played the same instrument, and they played in orchestra here in New Bedford before they went away, both of them. And my Uncle Joe said Lionel was the best clarinet player he ever heard, and he heard all the famous ones and everything. He said Lionel was great alto, but he's a clarinet. He's the best clarinet player I've ever heard. And then there were two brothers, Porky Brittle and Bill Brittle. They both were bass players. Porky went out to California with a sax player from New Bedford here, also Jimmy Lomba. And Porky ended up playing in the movie soundtracks. He played for Les Brown. And there's other Bill Brittle. He also played bass. He went to Canada, was a famous musician there. We had quite a few. And then, as I mentioned, this Jimmy Lomba, with Porky. They went to California, and Jimmy got in with Dinah Washington and a couple of other big bands. We had a few guys. And like I said, we have a few guys here that could have made it. That was not their choice. We have some great musicians here.
Yeah. I'm always telling my sister-in-law that I know that there's New Bedford, Detroit connections. I just can feel it in my blood. And I told you, during the pandemic, the Detroit Fine Arts Breakfast Club was forced, like everybody else, to postpone their live meetings. And we were doing a Zoom. And one thing got to another, and somebody said, "Hey, you're not from Detroit." And I said, "No, I'm from New Bedford." I said, "I live across the river now in Fairhaven." And it's like, "Oh, tell us a little bit more about New Bedford." And so I told them about New Bedford, and then I said, we're known for whaling, we're known for a bunch of things, but this is a big jazz town as well. And I went on and I told them the bits that I knew about Paul Gonsalves. And there was a young woman in the group. There's about 20-something people, over 20-something people on this Zoom meeting. Mm-hmm. And she said, so you're telling me that that there was, and she was like testing me, that there was a sax player from the Duke Ellington Orchestra? Yeah. And it was Paul Gonsalves? Yes. And she said, well, you know who the guy was that did all the scores for them? And I said, no. She said, Billy Strayhorn. And I said, I've heard that name. She said, well, you should. He was my uncle.
Oh, no kidding.
So she says, so she knew a little bit about New Bedford. I think she's just like trying to test me out,
Right, right.
but that was kind of cool. But I know there's more. There's more because you mentioned Dinah Washington, and of course she was like Aretha's. She was a family friend of Aretha Franklin,
Hmm.
and the world of musicians is a very small world, even though it's an
Oh,
international level, right?
yeah, yeah. It's a small world, and the guys don't have family with them. Their friends today, it's the friends they're in the band with right now. Next week they put in another band. They left that band. They're gonna find new friends because you're not in your hometown.
It's almost like
So
fishermen. That's how my
yeah,
stepfather was. He
yeah,
what they call a sight on, like, he could be on a boat, and if he didn't
yeah,
like how the captain did things or whatever,
yeah,
or he could get more money, he would jump to another ship. So he'd have
yeah.
all these friends that he met in all these ships, all these boats, fishing boats that he was on.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And that's where the musicians they left home. And it's funny that they'd love to come to New Bedford. This is funny. So I grew up in New York as a teenager, hang out with my uncle when they moved to New York, not to go listen to music, just so that because I could go, and hang out. So of course in the evenings I wouldn't be with them, but in the daytime I'd hang around with them. They'd go to the Union Hall and then go across, and all the famous musicians would be hanging around talking and things. And they always wanted to talk about New Bedford, and or I'd be in there, and the guy said, "Where you from? Where you from? Massachusetts, Boston? No, New Bedford. New Bedford. These are the musicians, hanging out in New Bedford. Oh man, I can't wait to get another gig there, or I can't wait to get a gig there. I heard about it." And I said, "Yeah, what?" So, I heard about in the Piccadilly and the other clubs, the beautiful Cape Verdean women, all dressed up sharp. you know, I
Oh
gotta
yeah,
get down to see. So that's what New Bedford was known through. The musicians in New York was known for, and they
yeah,
women did get all dressed up with their hats and
yeah.
everything, and the
Well,
men too. We all wore suits and ties when we went.
yeah. It's
You
funny because
know,
I heard stories that this was a big Liberty town, and a ship would come into Newport. And you
right,
figure, okay, you're in Newport, right? How far you got to go? They would jump in a
right,
car, a bus, whatever, and come to New Bedford. It was like, what?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's another thing too. We had on those jam sessions. We had a lot of great musicians that were stationed in Newport. Navy guys would come down and sit in on the jam sessions. They would play. Guys from the Navy band.
Wow. Hey, I'm
Newport
going to
Navy.
start wrapping this up, but I want to ask you a
Yeah,
question. I'm going to put you on a spot, and we're not live, so if you had an opportunity to host a podcast on the Artist Index to just focus on jazz and jazz musicians, would you do it?
yeah. I
It's for
would
pay.
consider it.
It's for pay.
Yeah, I'd
It's
consider that.
grant
You have
supported.
to explain it to me more, when we get time.
Sure, sure. But
But
I mean, you are like a vein in a gold mine. You know what I mean? We just got a couple of chips out today. There's got to
yeah,
be so much more.
and the sad part is nobody else, hardly anybody else my age, around it that lived through that time. Like as a kid, of course, like I said, because I was with my uncles all the time,
Right.
and so this I would like to leave information around because I don't know of anybody my age that from that time that's still around.
All right.
And all the musicians are gone. Of course, they were older than me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And before
Go ahead.
before we wrap up, one of your best memories ever, I mean, from your childhood, or I mean, I'm sure you got a lot of them, but there's got to be one that really comes back to you every so often and just makes you feel warm and fuzzy all over.
To do with jazz?
Yeah, it has to do with jazz, yeah, or living in the city, as with musicians or whatever.
There's so many. I know.
Or who's the most famous jazz musician you've ever met that you remember them fondly, not because of their craft, but because, damn, they were just a nice person too?
Oh, geez. Trying to think. I met so many, and to me, they were all nice. I can't think of anybody special offhand.
Yeah. You'll remember when we sign off.
Yeah, that's what's going to happen. I remember everything but names. I'm bad with names, but like I say, as a kid, just being around, walking around, the city of New York and meeting all these guys, it just was so exciting. But
And you were the kid all the time, right?
yeah, well, see, my uncle was the babysitter.
Yeah.
Like I said, I grew up in the house with all my family. My grandfather bought a house. He wanted to tell me he wanted all his family here. So I was the first grandchild. In fact, my uncle called me. They called me the baby brother. I was the only kid, and so being they were musicians, he and Paul, they were around during the day, so they would be the ones that would be taking care of me. And then as I grew old, I just hung out with him until he passed away. And he was also my godfather. But
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask you another question then. If there's one thing you could bring back from those days that you think would be not only entertaining but profitable, what would that be?
To be back, if we could have these little jam, well, there's not enough bands anymore, but they used to have a lot of little sets where 2 or 3 bands would play, like say or we had the State Armory in big buildings, and have festivals like that. And so you got different genres of jazz, because the word jazz covers so much music, and then they have different guys sitting with each other. I just wish we'd have the old jam sessions like they had before, where the musicians had the camaraderie, help each other when we're short. This is how I do it on the sax and things like that, other than just going out and see somebody play, put the instruments away and gone. It was like a little society. And
Yeah.
now it's just a show. That's what I wish it could come back to that,
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
I don't think
there
it
was
does.
so this is a good example of there was some good old days in the good old days. I mean, it wasn't always great, and there was always
No.
other issues, but there were good times. There were
Yeah.
good times, fond memories.
And there's another issue that hurts me, and I don't know if I should say that, is I go to all the jazz things, and I go to things, and I go with my white friends. My friends are white. I go, and the band is all white, and I'm the only person of color in the thing. And I wish that I'd see my people come back to jazz. And that's why, if you notice, there's hardly any young jazz musicians of color.
That is kind of
That
bizarre in a
really
way.
bothers me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't blame you.
Sit around. I don't say
Yeah.
it, but I sit around. I look around, and I say I'm the only. And when I was younger and I played basketball, it was just the opposite. I played a lot of sports. It was just the opposite. And some of my basketball players were asking, "Can I go with you to your club so I can listen to your jazz?" And here I am. I'm those guys now.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing.
That really that bothers me. Yeah.
And do you prefer David or Dave?
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Dave. Yeah. When I was on the program, it was Dave Reese.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Dave, thank you so much. We're definitely going to come back. We're definitely at some point going to have to meet for coffee or something stronger. And talk about the possibility to write you into a grant, because man, I just do not want. I mean, again, I told you I like listening to jazz, but I can't tell you really one musician from another. I've never.
Right.
It's like, okay, you go to your grandmother's house and you're having a really good meal, and you don't stop to well, how did she prepare this? What ingredients did she? It's like I'm just enjoying the meal. And that's how I feel about jazz. It's just it does what it does, and I don't try to break it up. Yeah,
and the thing about jazz is there's so many different genres of jazz, and it's all called jazz. So I used to be careful when that was my passion, introduce people to jazz, and that's why I did the radio and play the music I did to introduce them. And I had to be careful because there's a guy playing like John Coltrane, that's jazz. There's another guy playing like Count Basie, nice dancing music, that's jazz. So I'd be careful when I brought somebody to introduce them to jazz. I brought them to one that was more melodic and all that, so they wouldn't get turned away. Not that I don't like Coltrane, I like Coltrane and all that, but for somebody, the first time they heard jazz, it's kind of far out right away for them. Yeah. So the word jazz to me covers too. That's why I had that program. The class, Let's Talk Jazz, to explain that. I show all the different genres that's called jazz.
And one final thing, which is already the third final thing.
Yeah, that's all right.
But anyway, I remember the name of the gentleman who used to host the night train on WCOD, Otis Sutton.
Right.
Did you ever run across him?
I never met him, but I listened to him. Yep.
I used to listen to him and Eric Jackson on
Oh yeah, Eric I've
WGBH
met.
too.
Yeah.
Another. And again, I listened to these guys. I can't tell you one tune from another. It was just something about the jazz that was like breathing. Yeah.
Yeah. See, that's the reason why I had that class. I wanted to explain that to people, like what you just said. Yeah. Otis, wasn't he out of Martha's Vineyard?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, his
Martha's
voice was
Vineyard.
just so fantastic, and how he presented things. And he would do these little connection things, you know. So he threw history in there without making it like a class.
Yeah, and that's what I used to do. It was another thing. I wanted to draw people in. I didn't want to just play the music. I wanted to know about the music. But yeah. So yeah,
Well,
Eric, I got
so much.
a lot of things with Eric, a lot of the festivals and stuff backstage. Yeah. All right, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. Hold on a second, folks.
Sure.
Thanks for joining us with our special guest today, David Rees, or David Reis, more proper in Portuguese / Cape Verdean, or Cape Verdean / Portuguese. And wow, what a wealth of information, a wealth of knowledge that you have. And I definitely want to bring you back on, because this is part of our agenda of resurrecting the dead. Of the visual performing and literary and culinary arts, believe it or not, because without memories, we're nothing.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artists Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere.
Hi, this is Ron Fortier with another episode of the Artist Index. And as per usual, our guest is going to introduce themselves and spell their name for us. Guest?
Hi. Hello, I'm Kayla Conner. That's Kayla, Kayla, Conner, Conner.
So you do get the misspellings of Connor, huh?
All the time. Yeah, my maiden name is Conchina, and I thought that was hard, but Conner gets spelled just as often.
Wow. It is amazing. I mean, Fortier you'd think would be simple enough. Well, south of the Mason-Dixon is Fortier, which is closer to the correct pronunciation. Yeah. But I've been called Frontier, Fortin, oh my God, all kinds of different things.
Wow. Well, I get it. At least Conner, most people pronounce correctly.
Yes, exactly. Please tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're into yarn and knitting because my wife, we went through that whole thing, which was really sort of cool. My wife going to the knitting classes.
Yes, I know, that's so cool.
Yeah.
So that's actually, I guess, how I started off. I'm a painter now, but I started off with just knitting, and then I ended up learning how to crochet. This was maybe a couple of I want to say a couple of decades ago now. Oh my gosh, I sound like I'm
we are all aging.
Yeah, that's true. But I started mostly when I was in college to keep me from my mind wandering in lecture. I majored in philosophy, so there was a lot of mental stuff going on, and I kept my hands busy with knitting and then crochet, and I kept that up. So I'm currently trying to get a community going with knitting and crochet and fiber, because I felt really isolated for a long time. Not a lot of people my age were. They are now, and now that I'm in my 30s, but when I was in college, there wasn't really many people that were into that so much, and it's such a great way to stay mindful.
Yeah, it seems to make a resurgence every so often, and it cuts across gender as well. Probably one of the most famous knitters was Rosie Greer, who was an NFL, superstar. And he was responsible for tackling Sirhan, who was the assassin of Robert F. Kennedy.
Oh my gosh.
And yeah, so like that kind of thing. And then, there's the politically incorrect term, bitch and stitch.
Yeah. Right.
But I think these knitting circles, I'm probably going to get it, but I'm going to go for it anyway. With the age of feminism back in the 70s, which was a resurgence of the age of feminism from the 20s, when women were trying to get the right to vote and so on and so forth.
Right, the waves.
There's a sense of community that was never really, I think, paid attention to. I just finished reading Toni Morrison's Paradise.
Oh yeah.
And the convent. The women of the convent, my God, they were thought of doing all kinds of crazy things, but it's a very ancient ritual because, if we go all the way back in time, while the men were out hunting and slaying and doing all the stuff that men were required to do, engendered to do, whatever, the women were back watching the children, watching the home fires, the children, knitting, chewing on hides to soften them to make leather clothing. I mean, so there's this thing where the women seem to be more communal, home-based, whereas men are more communal, out of the home. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is interesting. I hadn't considered that, but yeah, that's at least at that point for quite some time. But there wasn't much of, there was, I'll go with that. Sure.
Well, yeah, and then now in this new research, I think the previous resurgence is that there were knitters that were covering trees and doing all kinds of
Yes,
things.
not yarn bombing. That's fun.
Yarn bombing, which seems to still be around.
They still do it. Right around the CVPA downtown, I see a couple of trees. Sometimes they'll cover them up, but
so there's that, and then there's this new thing. I think that's what really caught Paula's eye, was the meditative aspect of it.
Yeah, that I hadn't really. No, I knew from that's kind of the reason I continued knitting throughout school, because I have ADHD and I need something to keep my hands busy so that I can focus. And over the years, I developed fibromyalgia, and I ended up having to have a hip replacement a few years ago. So I had this issue with pain and being stuck in bed, and what got me through it really was knitting and crochet and craft work, because I could do a few stitches at a time, and then that was what I was focusing on. Really, it was one stitch at a time, one project at a time, and it helped the days go by until I felt better.
And you have an end product that you can be happy with.
Yes. I felt like I was constantly making some progress, even if I was just sitting all day. I was still doing something, feeling productive. It was very, very, so you're letting your mind still, but you're also being productive at the same time, and it's very affordable, which is the really important thing, I think. That you really, especially if you're doing acrylic yarn and a hook, you can really start for a couple dollars or free. I mean, there's people always, getting rid of old skeins of yarn, but you can't really, what's the word? People, I don't know that no one that we really think about how meditative. It's almost like a prayer bead for me.
I was thinking of that, either an Islamic meditative, yes.
Yeah.
Or a rosary.
Yeah, very similar to a rosary. Yeah.
Right. And the prayer beads, I mean, it goes across cultures and religions, obviously.
Yeah.
And not to be crass, but you end up with an end product.
Right. Which is nice when you feel really low and unproductive, which it was the case at the time.
Right. And, there's the practical application, obviously.
Oh, yeah. Very nice. Hats and scarves and toys for my daughter, Oh, that's really the thing, especially when it's hard to be a mother when you're disabled at any point, and I wasn't able to, run around with my kids at a really young time. And it gave us something to connect with. And now both of my children they can knit. They can't crochet yet, but they can knit, which is
let me ask you the question. What is the difference? Because there are people who, it's almost like a bumper sticker. You could have two sets. I can knit, but I can't crochet. I can crochet, but I can't knit. Is there a personality relationship to those statements?
I think so. Knitting is so much more structured. And crochet is a bunch of loops, and it's just almost endless. You can start and stop wherever. I think knitting helped me at first because of all the structure. It was easier to, work within a defined box, if that makes sense, to start. But some people just don't work well within a box, and crochet seems to work better for them sometimes, That's not always the case, but I do find that there seems to be some sort of thing there, almost and it helped me too, as a knitter. I started to crochet, and I started to think completely differently from knitting to crochet, because there's just a difference to the structure.
That's absolutely amazing. And of course, there's probably a third group. That's the group that can do both.
Yeah. And weaving, that's a whole other, oh, there's so many different little
Yeah,
pieces
yeah,
to it. Yeah.
yeah.
Endless.
Um, I remember one of before I bought my house, um, that the landlady's mom, well, called her Bubby. She was a Jewish
Bobby.
grandmother. Bubby was like in her um, 90s,
Oh.
and she would get sweaters from people regardless of where, if they were handmade or manufactured, machine made, and she would spend hours taking them apart and making skeins with them, and then she
Oh
would
my
make her
gosh.
own stuff.
Oh
It
my
was so
gosh, that's
cool.
great.
Yeah.
That's a process. That's a whole creative process.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing too
Wow.
is if I'm remembering correctly, she was losing her sight. It was getting dimmer,
Wow. Yeah.
but it didn't seem like the knitting required that much visual, because she would be talking and going
Hmm.
without even paying attention, well, visually, to
Yeah.
what she was doing. So that was, I always remember her when I see people.
I love that.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a great little story. I love I mean, I had my Vava, and she
yeah.
crocheted us all individual blankets, and we still have them, so many years later. And it's just like,
Oh, the Afghans.
yeah, the Afghans, right? Yeah, it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
a lot of people have that, shared experience of having something. Not everybody, unfortunately, but it is a very common experience, and it's so wonderful to share throughout the generations, especially now that I'm continuing on and teaching it to a whole new generation. And like my son is just so proud that he can make something out of his hands, just sit there and the thing that really gets me is that he knows that if he's feeling a little anxious, he can go to the corner and knit, and it calms his mind and he feels better. And it's just like it's a tool.
Yeah, unfortunately, he wouldn't be able to share that with his friends because he would be shamed.
Possibly, yeah.
There's still that kind of
Yeah,
thing that goes on. But it's so
yeah,
great because, I finally remember my stepfather, who was a fisherman all of his life,
yeah.
and quiet, unassuming man. I've heard stories from guys that fished with him, or the sons of the guys that my stepfather, because he died during the pandemic. He was 4 days
Oh,
short
I'm
of his
so
100th
sorry.
birthday. But I remember having to wind his needles, and I felt like I could never catch up. I could do 6 of them, and he'd be with his hand out because he could make a net from scratch. It was phenomenal.
Unbelievable.
And to see the precision of that was
That is interesting.
incredible.
Network. Yeah, that's a whole
Yeah,
other, very meticulous,
yeah.
very, very meticulous, but very practical.
Oh yeah, yeah,
You can see there's something very tangible at the end of that
yeah.
long process.
Yeah, I mean, we lived on Mott Street at the time. This is before he and my mother moved to Dartmouth and bought a house there.
Hmm.
But we was, on Mott Street, across the street was the Cornell Dubelier. We were on a second floor, and this was before the dike. It was,
Oh, wow.
the dike was built during our stay there. And, you could see the harbor and everything. It was just so cool. And it was also bonding. Oh, which brings me to genealogy and knitting. Is there such a thing? Or genealogy, knitting, crochet? Because what a great way to be able to get oral history. Because a lot of people are embarrassed. They don't think it's valuable. What do you want to hear that for? Oh, I'm, blah, blah, blah. All the poo-poos about, I don't want to tell you my story.
That
But
is
while they're knitting,
interesting.
it's
It just comes
almost
out. It is interesting.
like sodium pentothal, the truth drug.
Yes, yes, yes. I'm telling you though, it's something to do with keeping your hands busy and just your brain or your mouth opens up and you start to speak. But it's true. My grandmother spoke Portuguese, but when she was doing her crochet work and her knit. She did both, but she, she would just talk because her hands were busy, and she was sitting, and I would be with her, and the stories came. That's how I learned orally. Yes, for sure, definitely. She would talk. It's wonderful.
What are your fondest memories of that with her?
Oh, just time. I mean, time spent learning something new. Now, I mean, I'm still doing it, and it's something that I know that I had done with her for such a long time, and that I'm at a loss for words. I do write poetry.
I think
I wrote a
your
few
memory is
poems.
drifting. You're going back in time, and it's
Yes,
they're
I'm
flashing
currently
by.
there. Yeah,
It's like watching a train go by the station, and it's like,
Yep.
is that mine?
Yeah, absolutely. That's
Yeah.
the thought train is chugging along. Yep.
Yeah. So now on the flip side, as a painter, the art side, I mean, with your schooling, all that stuff.
Yes. So I went to UMass Dartmouth, SMU, for philosophy. Actually, I loved my tiny little philosophy class. There was like 8 of us in our graduating class.
Mhm.
Not many people. But I didn't really, I don't know. I wasn't really painting or anything until around when I had my surgery, because I was really, like, my hip surgery. I was stuck in bed for quite some time. It was a long-standing disability, so it was a longer process than it normally would have been. I was laid up for, I mean, I'm still technically recovering. It's been 3 years, but I'm almost there. And the worst part about it was being stuck in bed and the pain. So I started watercolor painting because there was less control with the water specifically. And I just kept doing it more and more because it was catching my attention. I was in flow with the water. I was in flow with the water. That's what I was doing. So I just started watercolor painting literally to keep me away from my pain. I was focusing on the water and coloring and my technique, and I wasn't thinking about where I was, the pain of my nerves growing, and that's how I healed, slowly but surely. And it took a few years, but I'm finally getting, a process down, and I'm feeling more confident in my art. But I don't have any schooling in, I mean, I took an off-loom weaving class at CVPA downtown, maybe in like 2011. That was wonderful, but I don't know. My brain was in philosophy mode at the time, and then after I had my kids, I just it was in knitting and art mode, and that's, yeah.
Now, Kathy Pope was in that department, right? Philosophy. Was it Kathy Pope?
I think so. That sounds. It's been a while,
Yeah.
but yeah, that sounds familiar. It was a very small department, but
and it's weird because economics is in the philosophy department or some weird thing like that, because economics is not it's not in business, it's in the philosophy.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I get it a little. I mean, it's a philosophy, sure, but if you think about it, everything's
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. You can really get it down into everything's a philosophy.
Yeah.
But it's helped me. I guess in certain ways, I feel like I did the theories of ethics and all of the theories of even epistemology. All right, so my thesis was on theories of.
You better finish epistemology because people are going to think you said
yes, epistemology, theories of knowledge, epistemology, theories of knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just had my head in books for a long time, and just focusing on that, and then right, it wasn't really getting me anywhere necessarily
Right.
at a certain point. But then it didn't really matter because I started painting, and that kind of brought me out of my shell more than anything.
Yeah.
Since then, I had a show at the Kilburn Mill recently, so that was really cool. I don't know, I just felt like I was so public for once, and I've been sharing my poetry for a couple of years now, but I did an open mic at the Unitarian Church in New Bedford, and that was really, really, really wonderful. You know, it's just like now that I've been embracing the artistic side of my life, the social part is blooming, I guess. It's great.
So, who were some of the people at this slam? I guess they call it, or reading.
Yeah,
I don't know.
poetry
Is this a
slam.
difference? Yeah.
Yeah.
Was
So,
Nicola Blank there?
not this time, no. But Nick, I'm very familiar with Nick. He's from he
Author?
started Anomaly Poetry, and I've published with
Okay.
them before. I love them. They do AHA nights, I think once a month at the Co-Creative Center downtown. That's really fun. That was really great because they were so welcoming. I started working with them even right before I had my surgery. I was in so much pain, but I still went out and, told my story, and I felt welcomed. And I think one of the first ones was at the Roachstone Stuff House. They had like a little open mic night there. That was really, really fun.
Now, let me ask you a question. As I'm thinking, I've never thought of it before, but his philosophy. So, other than going to school to be for a degree in philosophy, so that you can go and teach other people philosophy,
right,
it just seems like it's a closed circle.
Right.
I mean, it's not like you can work for the city. You can't work for the city as a philosopher, or, I mean, what jobs do philosophers get once they have a degree?
I had
they say fashion design isn't worth this degree.
I can't disagree with you. My only defense is I was obsessed. You couldn't get me to study anything else at the time.
But on the other side, it's got to give you great firewood for poetry.
Yes, that's true. That's wonderful. I love to write. I need to write. Yes, it goes with the art too, because I have the background in certain myths and legends, so they kind of
tell me about that. Tell me about myths and legends.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh man, I could go on forever. So I'm also a tarot reader, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Hero's Journey, Joseph Campbell.
Oh yes.
1,000 Faces, and
Campbell was one of my favorite guys. Yeah. I read his classic. I can't remember the title of it now, but it was a classic piece.
He has
and I also
lot
saw
of good
his series that he had on PBS. I think.
Yes, I think so. Yes,
Yeah.
it was very good, very good.
Yeah.
But basically, that ties in with the Tarot Major Arcana. So I work with I work with symbols every day. Well, every time I'm doing a tarot reading, really, because it's a visual language, and I don't know. It's kind of hard to put into words.
No. I understand. I this week I watched Forrest Gump twice this week.
That.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things. I use that like as a meditative thing, believe it or not. People think it's crazy, it's funny, it's stupid, whatever. But I especially that feather caught me from the first frame.
Oh yeah.
When I saw it a million years ago, and I've seen it probably about 100 times. And every time I see it, I see something different.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that scene, it became a classic scene where they say that it was like a juxtaposition with Andrew Wyatt's Christina's World, when Jenny falls to the ground after she throws her shoes and stones at the house, and she, we know she was being sexually abused by her father. But towards the end of the movie, after Jenny dies, Forrest has the house bulldozed.
Yep.
And then so that's talking about symbolism there.
Right.
And then there's the maze of on Jenny's father's property of the corn and the tobacco. And then he's at their tree.
Yes.
Where he buries her.
Yes.
And I never realized before in my paintings that the new ones that I've been doing, they almost always have birds in them.
Oh, birds.
And whether crows, seagulls, or what's the word? The more symbolic shapes of birds rather than a specific species of birds.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see the birds just come sweeping from right of the frame and buzz across. And I was like, wow, I think this is probably where I got this, because to me the birds are souls.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. So
that makes sense.
Yep.
Sun and moon, and people say, is that the sun or the moon? I was like, I don't know. It's whatever you want it to be, because it's got to be there. And generally, it's the light that each of them gives. That if I'm doing these historic tragedies, whether it occurred in the family or it's something that happens in African American history, that it's symbolic that nothing escapes the light, and that light is truth.
Yep.
Amazing. Yeah. So how long have you been writing poetry?
I've always been interested in it, but I only started publishing maybe 2019. Like I said, right before I had my hip replacement. I was so shy, but then there was a lot of pain. And then after that, I just didn't care anymore. Everything was easier because, I feel like, I don't know if
you feel liberated, you feel lighter.
Yes, absolutely. I just felt like I was restricted for most of my life. I got hurt when I was 13. So it was from 13 until I had my replacement at 30 years old. I had 2 kids already. So it was I feel like I've been reborn. But it is interesting because there are a lot of birds in the artwork as well. And I think that is purposeful. I feel like my soul is free, just like my body is free. There's this forward movement, this resurgence that's coming along with the freedom to be myself.
Yeah, and that's it, and that is permission as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Giving yourself permission to be who you are rather than fit into somebody else's slot or whatever.
Absolutely. That was the big thing. My own permission. So,
I know when I lived in Portugal, and I would say, people would say, so what do you do? I'd say, I'm a painter. You're a painter? I would say, yes. And they say, oh, have I ever seen your work? Is it hanging up anywhere in town? Is it in a gallery currently? Is it in a book? Is it online? And they were really excited by it. Here, so what do you do? I'm a painter. And the classic response is, so you make any money doing that?
Just like that.
So you make any money doing that? Did you make a living?
So far, I mean, honestly, I've had to, what's the word? Spread the love around, differentiate. I have a lot of streams. I make candles and perfumes and stuff. And I do tarot readings and Reiki, and that's really what I make my money off of. It's not a ton of money. It's just, enough to help with around the house.
Exactly.
Spending money, but it's fulfilling. And I mean, the art is really, it's just for me, but I feel like it's just, what's the word? It's expansive. It's an expansion of consciousness. The more I do physically as well.
Now, your paintings, how do you approach them? Because you said Reiki, and I'll tell you a quick story.
I'm so excited. Yes.
How do you approach them?
Most of the time with a painting, I have an image in my head. And I'm compelled to whatever that may be. The last one I did was a turkey vulture, and I had the wings, the wingspan, an expansion of the wings, and the image of it on a branch, and that was it. So I do an outline with a pencil, and then I watercolor over a few different, with a few different washes, but I try my best to let the brush lead me, or be led versus anything.
I understand that completely.
Yeah, it's just a letting go and letting it happen. I never really know how it's going to come out at the end, but I usually know when it's finished.
No, I understand that because a friend of mine and I, we went to go see the show at the Narrows.
Oh yeah,
the Working Women show, and
yes.
And he and I graduated from SMU way
Yes.
back in 1975, and we were talking about this level of consciousness or losing yourself.
Yeah.
Which is in actuality the opposite, because you're finding yourself.
Yeah.
And I think the flamenco dancers, there's a term called duene, where they go into that zone.
Yep.
And they are totally connected, disconnected. They're connected to whatever that wavelength is that they're on, but they're disconnected from the audience. And it's kind of a cool thing to think about.
I hadn't even considered flamenco. I need to look into that. That's all very, very, very similar. Yeah, it's like a on, and you just go, and then it's creation. And yeah, sure, more like tuning into a wavelength. I hadn't considered that.
And and I don't want to. I mean, one of the it wasn't actually one of the reasons, but I'm sort of glad I got away from the abstract work and went into more figurative narration, or, to borrow from Philip Guston, socially conscious expressionism.
Yeah.
Is that there is so much abstract work out there, and unfortunately, a portion of it, and this is with no malice or negativity, a lot of people do it because they think, oh, it's so much fun. Well, I'm not telling you that I'm having my fingernails ripped out while I'm painting, but
it's not the same.
It's not the same of, it's pushing paint, yes, but there's a difference between, well, you're Portuguese.
Yes.
You understand cooking. If you cook without love,
there's nothing in it.
You taste it, which sounds stupid. Yeah. You taste the love not being there.
Yeah. It's empty.
Exactly.
It tastes empty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and I do understand the idea of being guided. More so, my wife's late father was a physician and was an artist all of his life, sculptor primarily.
Oh wow.
I've got a copy of a pastel that he did when he was 14, which is phenomenal for a 14-year-old kid.
I love that.
And it's in my studio, and I swear sometimes when I'm painting, I can feel him.
Yeah.
I've never met him, but I can feel him. And I'll go reach for a color, and I was like, no, not that one. Yeah.
Yeah, you can hear it. Yeah.
Yeah. I know, I know it's none of my French relatives, because they was, I feel a slap on my hand. No, not that one. But anyway, yeah. So there's a great deal of spirituality. And I guess also you've seen people who use spirituality more as what would you call it?
Crutch?
A crutch, a ruse, a toy, entertainment.
Yeah.
Right.
That's, yeah.
Before I tell you that story, what do you do with left-handed knitters and crocheters?
Oh, I'm a lefty.
Oh my God, you've got to be like in huge demand then.
Well, the thing is, I just have to mirror my mind. So
I have heard that left-handed crochet and knitting instructors find it easier to instruct right-handers than right-handers. Most right-handers can't instruct left-handers at all.
Right. Yeah.
That's kind of interesting.
To learn. It was harder to crochet, I think, because of that. Knitting, not so much.
Yeah.
But once I learned crochet, the flipping in my brain already happened. if that makes sense. So teaching
Yeah.
others, I already know how to do the mental calculations in my mind, if that makes sense.
All right.
It's like almost like, I don't know, mirror writing, or like I'm
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so much more to the arts than unfortunately, a lot of the stuff, like our culture, American culture, has romanticized art to some silly extent.
Oh, I see what you,
Rene Ricard, who, if you've ever watched the biopic Basquiat,
yep.
There's this guy with a Civil War cap in the park, and he's writing, there's nothing more overblown than the myth of the starving artist in his garret. Everybody wants to get on that Van Gogh boat. That guy, by the way, lived here in New Bedford, Rene Ricard. And it's true. It's true about, the starving artist, the years of starvation and not being known or recognized. But I think it really does come down to two things, where you have to choose between being supported by art versus being supported by your art versus being sustained by your art.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Now,
I hadn't considered that.
all right. Well, I mean, you got it going with the whole philosophy thing. I love
thank you. It's just, I just got to keep going. That's the thing. It's from one day to the next. The art keeps me going is the real.
It's true.
It really is. It really is. I'm getting hot now. Oh, gosh.
Well, let me get you onto the story then, because we've got about 10 minutes left.
Thanks.
I was at I had a solo show in Germany, and it was in Kaiserslautern, which is next to the Army Hospital in Landstuhl. Landstuhl is adjacent to Kaiserslautern, or as most of the people, the troops call it, just K-Town, because it's a lot easier to say. But it was a great opportunity to have an exhibit there in Germany, and very different vibe. The artist gets dressed up. Everybody gets dressed up. It's like going to church. It's kind of interesting. And this one woman is on the side, and she's listening to me answer questions from some people. And then she steps up and she points at this painting, which happens to be the very last one in the series. I did 20 pieces. And she points at it and says, "Who's the woman?" And I'm like, excuse me? Who's the woman? I said, I don't deal with figures. I deal like a mindless, stream of consciousness. I try to paint cold-bloodedly, blah, blah, blah. Who's the woman? And then she said, I'm sorry. Let me introduce myself. And she told me her name. And then she said, I'm a Reiki master. I work at the base hospital. And she said, there is a woman in that painting.
In that painting.
Think back to when you did it. So I said, okay.
Oh my gosh.
I was like, oh, okay. So I was getting all of these paintings done so I could ship them to Germany. And this, because Paula and I were getting married in June. The show wasn't until September, but the gallery owner said, yeah, it's cool, not a problem.
Right.
And it was the very last painting. And I said, I'm going to paint this one for Paula. If she likes it, great. If she doesn't, not a big deal, right?
For Paula.
For Paula. So the woman said, do you realize that you have painted an almost perfect love chakra? Do you know what a chakra is? I said, well, like an aura that, and she went on to explain the whole painting. It was absolutely amazing. And then she gets up to the top of the painting. She says, there's a lot of blue there. That's your respiration. Was shallow breathing? I said, well, I was getting married, I guess.
Amazing.
But it was, and I've had that kind of thing with work before. There was a bunch of young Korean American women at a gallery opening in Chicago. At the gallery was next to what was Koreatown, and they were all brilliant students at the local universities, Northwestern or University of Chicago, whatever, anyway, and so I had to do the artist talk, and I had I paint cold-bloodedly, no emotions, blah blah blah. It's just an exercise, and they almost physically accosted me. And like, no. And they started talking to me about each painting, which was in a way very creepy because it was like, oh my God, it's almost like this isn't a recording of some sort. And they
read it. They can understand.
They were like in my studio. That was the
Yeah.
strangest thing, you know?
Very, very odd. Mm-hmm.
So what's next? What's next? What's the next thing on the horizon?
What's next? Good point. The silence is killing me. I guess
Yeah,
I'll
I hate
see.
that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Something bigger, I guess, because why not?
Do you believe it happens as it's supposed to happen?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm just waiting for the next breadcrumb at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you a question then. Pushing the universe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are these people who say you have these, you know, what you have to visualize it. You have to repeat these things. You know, what is it that you want? Or you have to say, if you want to be a painter, you can't say, I want to be a painter. You have to say, I am a painter and blah, 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 blah. But I really don't find that works. I really find that, like with Forrest Gump, it's that damn feather.
Yeah. That damn feather.
What does that feather represent to you?
You're being your higher self, I'd say. I know I don't know everything, but just that. I know I don't know everything.
No. That's it. It's an opinion.
Yeah.
It's an opinion.
For
You know,
sure.
not a manifesto.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you're knitting and or crocheting, what's that?
Hope.
Oh,
I think
hope.
Isn't that Emily Dickinson? Hope is the thing with feathers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're knitting or crocheting, do you ever get that thunderclasp of, oh, I got to drop this and I've got to paint?
Yes.
So it is pre-execution.
I guess it's just an image. It's more like I get a marching order and then I have to execute. If that makes any sense.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, this has been wonderful, and it went by like really incredibly fast. I got to try to think of a Barbara Walters. She was on 2020, and she always used to ask that. Now I guess they're known as Barbara Walter questions. You know, if you were a tree, what kind of a tree would you be? So I'm trying to think of something. And so I'm going to go with a magic wand. If I gave you a magic wand, or somebody gave you a magic wand that actually had magic in it because they were a magic person, but they said you only have one wish, what would that one wish be?
Oh gosh, it sounds so corny, but I love, like just the idea of love and unity. So it's I'm a hippie, I guess. Love. Yeah,
that's a very underrated emotion. That's another one of those things that's been plasticized. Yeah. This has been fantastic. Do you have any questions before we sign off?
Thank you so much. Not me, but I thank you so much. This has been a journey, and thank you. I really liked it. It was fun.
Yeah, people say, well, what are you going to ask me? Could you send me a list of questions? I haven't the funniest idea what I'm going to ask you until I start talking.
That's the best way, I think.
Exactly. That's what conversation is. It's not a script.
Absolutely.
Kayla, hold on a second. Well, folks, that ends another episode of the Artist Index, the In Focus podcast. And we want to thank our guest, Kayla Conner. Kayla, parting words?
Be love.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube.